Now I would like to ask our next panelist, Mr. Andrew Eiva. Andrew Eiva will talk about the U.S. interest in Balochistan. Welcome, Mr. Andrew.
I'm rather pleased to see, I'd like to make a little comment on Catherine Porter's husband, John Porter, who introduced back in 1988 $800 million for Afghan reconstruction. And there were 11 other congressmen co-sponsored it. It never built up support for it to pass. Those of us supporting Afghanistan did not mobilize behind it properly. And I think a lot of the problems of the Taliban and everything else, the closest we came to fixing that was when your husband introduced that legislation back in 1988. Myself, I took an interest in the Baloch cause, introduced to it by David Dienstag, who's also here. I've counted that there are a very small element in American politics and American culture of people who believe that the support of resistance movements, people fighting for their freedom, is a precious and important thing for us, for our country to do. I've counted in 40 or 50, well, in 50 years, I've been watching this since my childhood. I was born in a refugee camp the same year Balochistan was conquered by Pakistan. And I grew up dreaming of helping the Lithuanian resistance and other resistance movements. And in the course of that, I found a total of, until now, 23 Americans by name only who have taken a position that we need to support resistance movements effectively to fight for their freedom. Several of them were presidents. John F. Kennedy was one. He formed the Green Berets. On the Green Beret crest, he put De Oppresso Liber, which means liberate the oppressed. It's taken right out of Isaiah 61, which Jesus Christ was recorded as stating, introducing himself in Luke 4, saying, I have come to liberate the oppressed and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. So these values have occurred in American history, but they're not very strong. When I mentioned this to a Special Forces colonel about a month ago, when I told him there were 23 Americans that supported this, he said, yeah, and were they all killed? And I said, no, some of them were only fired. In a few examples, Michael Gerson, a speechwriter for George Bush, wrote his 2004 inaugural address, and these principles were said then. And the next day, the front page of the Washington Post, George Bush said we should support those fighting for freedom. That's part of America's strategic goal. And the next day, the White House disavowed, according to the Washington Post, George Bush's remarks. Richard Haass, who was president of the Council of Foreign Relations at the time, spent 2 hours on C-SPAN explaining how ridiculous that assertion was. And Michael Gerson himself ended up resigning from the White House in disgust because the ideas went nowhere and took so much flack. Many of these people are conservatives recently. Well, by the way, Paul Tsongas, who led the effective congressional revolt against the betrayal of the Afghan cause, which was happening at the beginning of the Reagan administration, he was one of these 23 people. However, since then, they've been more conservative, although there's been a recent glimmer of hope. In the case of Libya, which people like to complain about one way or another, there are 3 people who drove through the idea of saving Benghazi with airstrikes. And none of them was a career bureaucrat. They were all political appointees. Susan Rice, Hillary Clinton, and Samantha Power. I don't know how much heat they're in from the people below them for doing that, and they will take the fall if things go wrong in Libya for having taken that case. One person who went there, a senator who went there directly during as the Libyan war started recently, several weeks ago, Senator John McCain went on the ground. He's one of these 23 Americans. Senator John McCain went on the ground and said we should not arm the Libyan resistance. That's a long-term, solid goal. It's not clear if Gaddafi's forces can be defeated with airstrikes alone, but an effective resistance could be done. However, since however, we have not done that. As a matter of fact, when I was in the Special Forces, I used to be a captain. Special Forces was formed to support resistance movements originally. And my battalion commander called me in because I was training people in guerrilla warfare. He said, Andrew, you will destroy your career if you train people in guerrilla warfare. We don't do that. We never will do that. We have no interest. And that is the battalion commander. He was Hungarian. He had fled 1956. Nicholas Roscovani Eive is his name. And America will never support resistance movements. Well, I had access as a Special Forces officer with a clearance to their library on covert operations at the John F. Kennedy Center. And I had a chance to study the histories there of how the U.S. does support resistance movements. Usually, it does not. Usually, it's on the side of the oppressors. In the case of Khartoum or the Sudan regime right now, the Central Intelligence Agency works in open cooperation with members of the Khartoum regime. They don't have a problem with that. They don't consider the resistance there. But nevertheless, there were 12 times when the U.S. got involved to support arguably legitimate resistance movements. Poland, Albania, Lithuania, China, Ukraine, Sumatra, Kurdistan twice, Tibet, Cuba, Angola, and the Homayoon tribe in Laos. All 12 the aid in each case was half-hearted, non-committal, and in all 12 cases, the resistance movements were destroyed. Afghanistan was on the way to being number 13 until Senator Tsongas led the revolt in Congress to overturn that policy. It took 5 years to convince the American policymakers that the CIA was on its way to loss number 13. And during that time, while that convincing debate happened, perhaps 1 million Afghans paid with their lives. But once the American people did come to their senses, they fired the deputy director of the CIA, John McMahon, demanded the selection of better weapons, and President Reagan signed a new national security decision directive calling for getting the Soviets out by all means available. The selection of better weapons blew the Soviet Air Force out of the sky from 1986 to 1988, and the Afghan love of freedom won the final battle of the Cold War, was the final battle that essentially ended the Cold War, and dozens of countries went free from the Soviet Empire, including my ancestral homeland, Lithuania. So there was earlier, let's see, Wahid Baloch said, a threat to freedom anywhere is a threat to freedom everywhere. I'd like to reverse that. A threat to tyranny anywhere is a threat to tyranny everywhere. The Afghan victory had echoes across a large part of the planet. So what we have here is people's love of freedom is a very powerful weapon. I was asked to speak on American interests in Balochistan, and we could discuss the Chinese balance of power and what's going to happen when the Chinese take over Gwadar port, and the Pakistan's alignment with the Chinese, and so on. And those are strategic considerations, except nobody in this town thinks strategy anyway. and nobody affects votes in Congress with any strategic thoughts. But there are people who love freedom. And those people who put it on the line for freedom, as your people are, at great sacrifice and courageously, as did the Afghans, have a tremendous love for freedom. Not every country does. That list I read you earlier were people who did fight back. Many people never fought back. The Czechs, there's a lot of them that never mounted a guerrilla movement amounting to anything. People who can mount a resistance movement the way you have, the sacrifices of each family that's involved, to keep going when you see your relatives showing up cut to pieces on the streets, knowing when the Pakistani services find out who your relatives are or your friends are and round them up and make them disappear while you are fighting. The price of keeping one soldier in the hills is a very high one. And you should be very proud of them. I was very glad that Tariq Baloch mentioned the 5 insurgencies of the Baloch people against Pakistan domination. It's a remarkable achievement, and one of which you should be proud. Now, in Washington, I mentioned the 23 people. Now, let's talk a little bit of the history of why these people do get fired or killed. I would start it at two people who were, no, we'll start with George Kennan. We'll skip one. We'll start with George Kennan, who published something, who was considered still a god in the State Department for the essay he wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine signed X that said a policy of containment is the way to cope with the Soviet Union. That meant a policy of status quo. That means we don't try to overthrow governments that are under Soviet control. We don't support people who could overthrow them. That policy made a lot of sense in Washington. It made sense in the State Department, in the Pentagon, and the CIA. Why? Because the existence of oppressive and aggressive enemies justifies the funding for those organizations. That is a core American interest, because at this economic time, who we fund for what purpose becomes much more important. How did that tendency affect us in Iraq? Before we invaded Iraq in Desert Storm, there was a general named Downing in the National Security Council. He wrote something called the Downing Plan. It called for supporting the resistance movements of Iraq. It would have involved several hundred Americans, essentially in a logistics and training role, and it would have cost about $2 billion a year. And however, that would not have allowed $1 trillion of spending on our bureaucracies and agencies. So the choice here in Washington was made not to empower freedom, but to do our own control. We called it freedom, but we came in, invaded. I don't know how much of the exaggeration or falsification of the weapons of mass destruction controversy, whether that was simply the incompetence of the intelligence communities or whether that was deliberate falsification. But at the end of the day, it paid off to invade rather than empower the Iraqi people's own desire to be free. For that, America has paid a $1 trillion price, thousands of dead, and over 10,000 badly wounded. A price that was unnecessary, and if we had allowed and empowered the Iraqis themselves to take their country in their own hands. During the Cold War, there was 1 or 2 incidents when were instructive to me. At one point, I had a high-ranking CIA official gave a briefing on what happened at the first meeting at the CIA after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. of this at the top of the CIA echelons. John McMahon, who was number 4, director of operations actually at that time, number 4 in the CIA, walked into the room and said, "I just talked to my Soviet counterpart." This is what he says, that the U.S., if the U.S. supports the Afghan resistance, this will fundamentally injure U.S.-Soviet relations. And John McMahon said, let us recommend that that we not start a covert operation to support the Afghan resistance. That recommendation went to the CIA director, Stanfield Turner. He signed John McMahon's recommendation. He recommended we not support the Afghan resistance. That recommendation went to Secretary of State Cyrus Vance. He recommended we not support the Afghan resistance. They all just fell into line. But there was a political appointee at the National Security Council meeting, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who went through the roof when he saw these recommendations came in, and Jimmy Carter, sort of in between, struck a compromise of a half-hearted initial effort to support the Afghans as a compromise measure. So the first 3-4 years of supporting the Afghan resistance were very weak. That did not change immediately when President Reagan came in. It took a while. It took a congressional rebellion to do that. So right now you are affecting a key American interest, and it will depend our own national ability to survive, to defeat our enemies, to defeat tyrants. There's resistance in Iran. A lot of people are dissatisfied with that regime. The people in Sudan, the resistance movement was asked one time in a public occasion a mile from here. Yahya Mohammed of the Masalit resistance of Darfur was asked, if you were given effective aid to the Sudanese resistance, how long would the Khartoum regime last? He said, a week. However, the issue of aiding the Sudanese resistance has not even come on the table. And they have put a lot more blood and lives on the field many times of what the Baluch have done. You talked about the battle where all the wives and children were being hit by the Cobra gunships, while the men were motivated to come down. Well, in the initial fight in Darfur, the resistance won 40 out of 44 battles. That's according to even the State Department Special Envoy to Sudan, Andrew Natsios, came up with that number. 40 out of 44 battles. But then the regime started attacking the women, the children, the relatives of the resistance in a massive way, killing perhaps 400,000. And crippling the Darfur resistance. And they're still nervous. These governments can spend a lot of money. But there's another element in the ruling class here, maybe even a little more devious and a little more clever than the State Department, CIA, and Pentagon. That's K Street. In the case of Sudan, I saw a document covering budgeting $18 million to affect the new administration. This was written in about 4 months before the Obama-McCain election. And it documented $18 million, $1 million of that 18 months, I mean, 1 million of those $18 million would be spent on each of the presidential campaigns. It gave the names of the co-chairmen in each campaign who would be receiving that $1 million. I have not managed to find a trail, but we do have the original budget in a number of safe locations if anything happens to me. In Pakistan, the money being used on K Street is a little bit less. You don't, Pakistan is not an oil exporter, cannot afford an $18 million project in Washington. They initially spent it with Cassidy and Associates, $1.2 million there, to muffle things in Congress. And the last large spending I was able to trace was from Loch Lord Strategies. I don't have a figure on them. I'm estimating based on the visits somewhere and so forth as approximately $1 million also to protect Pakistani aid. And what do they get for the money they spend? In the case of Pakistani aid, they managed to write the aid in a certain way that locks it in for a 5-year period. They did that about a year and a half ago. And that makes it very difficult to overturn. You would think Congress could block that somehow once that's in there, but it's not. It can be done. As a matter of fact, if you're following the debate here over the Affordable Health Act, as it's called Obamacare, they've locked in a lot of spending there for 5 years the same way. And what it comes down to is the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee gets to traffic these appropriations, these cutoffs. And the Rules Committee's own power depends on these delays holding up. So it would take quite a congressional revolt to overturn the spending. But it is possible. They're talking about doing it on Obamacare, and it would be functionally involve the same legal issues with the Rules Committee to reverse Pakistani aid. There is one group of people in the country, an interesting group of people who have come up in the United States to oppose spending and who are passionate about it, and that's the Tea Party. Now, the Tea Party is not interested in foreign aid or foreign policy too much, but I believe they would be impressed if they knew about, if you'd have some in your own area, they would be impressed that people are fighting for their freedom, for a tolerant society in Balochistan, a democratic, structure-loving society where Christians and Muslims can marry and live together in peace, where Hindus can go without being raped by their neighbors, where Christian communities are not being massacred the way they are in the rest of Pakistan. Not to mention what the Baloch themselves are going through. The Hindus are not to be overlooked, the fact that they're getting raped and murdered up in Pakistan. Why? Because there's 2.6 million Indian Americans in the United States. In the last 20 years, they've gone into the hotel business here. Many of them become hotel-owning millionaires. Asian American Hotel Organization is an organization of mostly Indian Americans, and they've elected 2 governors, Nikki Haley in South Carolina and Bobby Jindal in Louisiana. They're only touching the Mumbai issue around the edges, so you can't go through the top, but I think many Indians who are more advanced thinking would respond. Indian Americans who are more advanced thinking would respond to a message of empowering freedom in the South, especially in the South Asian region. India's own strategic future is somewhat at stake over the victory of freedom in its region. India faces one less enemy than we Americans do, actually, the Indian policy-making decision. Why? They have never really built up a serious defense industry. It is defense industry that profits most from these big enemies and these big wars. So they don't have much less vested interest in these expensive special interests that we have than they have much less interest than we do. Because they don't have a large military bureaucracy. They have wonderfully avoided that. Now, even though in the Tea Party I have not seen any expressions of a foreign policy, and when I've made some initial approaches, both on Sudan, which is a bigger resistance movement, I have not yet clicked. Although 3 of the leaders of the Tea Party are on that list of 23 that I mentioned. Remember, I mentioned 23 Americans who have advocated freedom. 3 of them, the Tea Party looks to, at least in part, for leadership. One, Michelle Bachmann. She has held a press conference supporting the Iranian resistance. She was the only person running the press conference. It was her idea, and she announced to the press on her own. She was not, I don't think anybody paid her any money for it or anything like that. It was a principled stand. She took a stand for the Iranian resistance. Newt Gingrich took a stand in one of his speeches as one of the 23 Americans who supports the idea of supporting resistance movement. But the most eloquent and extensive advocacy of aiding those who fight for freedom was done by someone you probably would never guess, Sarah Palin. When she gave the address at Nashville, if you Google Nashville YouTube, Palin, you will get the speech from somewhere between minute 10 and minute 15. It comes out different times, but it's between minute 10 and 15 for about 2 or 3 minutes. She talks about the importance of supporting those who fight for freedom. So if you do come to Tea Party friends, you have some people who have taken a stand. And I mentioned they don't like John McCain too much, but he did also advocate arming the Libyans. There's a very important issue there. The airstrikes, when the U.S. was involved, were costing us $500 million a week, or roughly $1 billion for 2 weeks. Arming the Libyan resistance, $200 million for a year. So for a year, it would cost us 5 times less than bombing them for 2 weeks. There's one I had experience with the Lithuanian resistance. That was my formative experience. And the Lithuanian was also conquered by a neighbor in 1940, not 1948. We had a bloody resistance. We killed a lot of those occupiers, but we were eventually crushed militarily in 1953. And then we had a long-term nonviolent resistance movement. And in Lithuania, we had to face many of the same difficult decisions that the Balochistan resistance has to face. For example, one thing that made the Lithuanian resistance different, even though they kept Soviet prisoners alive in some cases, but when the Soviet government brought in Russian-speaking farmers to take the place of Lithuanian farmers, the Lithuanian resistance made the difficult decision that we have to kill these people. We didn't like it, and we remember that. And we fought them hard in the military sense, but also in that sense. However, we preserved the Lithuanian character of our countryside. So when the chance came for a nonviolent resistance movement in the late 80s, during the Gorbachev reforms, Lithuania was culturally strong enough to lead the way. The resistance was in 2 parts, who were fighting each other very hard, a type of fight that you are familiar with. The larger part believed in the autonomy of Lithuania, or sovereignty, There's a big argument. What's the difference between autonomy and sovereignty? Boy, that was an argument in those days, in the 88, 89. There was a smaller group, nothing but independence. The rest of you are all traitors. You're really working for the communists. And we're only going to go for independence. So you had these two, and it looked like we would never be free. These two groups were spending 80% of their energy accusing each other. But they were moving forward. When the showdown came, and I was there for that, they both came together. Some of the autonomy people did oppose making Molotov cocktails for defending the parliament. But they were overruled. By that time, the independence forces were strong enough to win that argument. But that took, the victory of that nonviolent movement required one very important thing, which the Baluch are very weak on. And the reason I got into the story was to make this one very important point. It was one of the key factors of success in that, to make that work, was the Lithuanian outreach to the people leading the fight for Russian freedom. It's not easy conceiving. For us, they were our Punjabis. So what did that mean in our case? In our case, it meant that when Yeltsin could not do his campaign materials in the Soviet Union, they printed them in Lithuania for him, the Lithuanian communists. The Lithuanian communists would probably hold the same rule as the Baluchis you have in the current Baluch governmental administration, could be in some way compared to that. What role can they do in supporting Punjab freedom? The Punjabis are fighting for their economic future. They're a dynamic, hardworking people whose economic future is being stolen by a corrupt, mismanaged regime. They have a real problem. So, visionary Punjabis, they've seen some of their politicians, Benazir Bhutto, that government of Punjab province, get assassinated. And they've seen what the Punjabis have been done to Pashtun culture, at least in the Pakistani side, for the last 20 years. They've transformed a freedom-loving people, or parts of them at least, into a brutal, oppressive, extremist people. And they're trying to do the same thing to the Baluch right now. This is a dark future for Punjab, and it's a future which you should do everything you can from your side to be a source of light to them. The Punjabis of Sudan are called the Nile River Arabs, 3 tribes who run the genocide, get all the oil. The cardinal, who's a Nile River Arab, when the Khartoum was conducting the genocide in the Nuba Mountains, flew down to the Nuba Mountains and stood with the Nuba people, slowing down the genocide, and actually, along with the military resistance of the Nuba, that did help stop the genocide, at least of the Nuba mountain people, in '98. So a single Punjabi, in this case, of goodwill, can be worth, on the ground, 500 sarmachars, strategically speaking. And they should be treasured in that way. They should be protected, nourished, built up, every way you can. The victory, ultimately, if the Punjabis are under a control of some brutal dictator in the future, you could have another Bosnia as you come closer to independence. But if you study, in the Yugoslav case, the difference between Bosnia and Slovenia, Slovenia got its independence with 100 casualties, Bosnia got its independence with 200,000 casualties. That's a very important difference. If you study the differences, how the Slovenians, when they were fighting for independence, what they did in reaching out to the Serbs. And in their first battle of the Serbs, they were so well organized they killed about 50 people, boom, in the first battle. And then they reached out. So there's a tough, so even though, so for some of you, an effective resistance may be the best thing to support. For others, reaching out to the Punjabis of goodwill. The two do not work against each other. The Slovenes had a very strong initial military action in which they defeated the initial Serb units, but at the same time, Slovenians were reaching out to Serbian mothers of soldiers, to the Serbian government, to the future of Serbia, and Serbia's freedom, and they won their independence with roughly 100 total casualties, counting both sides. Lithuania, roughly the same number, less than 100 on the second one. The first one cost 100,000 on each side, the first fight. But it laid the groundwork with its strength for the victory on the second time, which was in human terms much cheaper. So the Sarmachars and those who fight for independence are your cornerstone, your backbone. Without them, this meeting would not be taking place. But on the future, your final victory will depend on the assertion and the decision by Punjabis of goodwill who will see an independent Balochistan, something that would work well with a reformed and free and tolerant Pakistan. Those two ultimately are together as goals. Otherwise, it will be a fight over oil. Yeah, that was, thank you for your time, and I will help you as I can.
Thank you so much.
Can we ask a question or
You can.
Let's ask a question.
another? My question actually is,
Well, the more the better, but
well, the question is it's neutralized in the sense that their political leadership are neutralized, that if we support vigorously Baloch, you know, we have what the rest of the world will say about Kashmiris and other things. I mean, there are other factors. But I think India is very much concerned, but they are themselves, you know, in a situation, another side of things. I have not heard good articulated case about how resistance movement can articulate their case to American leadership or American politicians. Unfortunately, there are only 23, because it doesn't really, they're not able to convince with immediate something that immediately will appeal to American interest. Can you sort of give us a little bit pointers how these supporting resistance movements does support American interest, and how in the long run they can benefit the American interest?
the most powerful interest is the American interest, at least today, the American interest in freedom, in a more effective way to project our power overseas. We cannot afford, in Afghanistan, well, let me think. There's the Baloch case and how it's done in the past. There's two different parts. Congress does not rebel against policy that easily. They may rebel for one speech, but to make a long-standing resistance, like a resistance movement in Congress. It happened for Afghanistan. It took 5 years before effective weapons started to go. That rebellion took 5 years to support. We were lucky to have one member of Congress. Well, there were two members of Congress, 2 senators, and that's the only 2 in all of Congress out of 535 members who believed in this, what I call the idea of strategy of supporting resistance movements, who ever said it publicly. Only 2. And they both played a key role. Right now, there is not a single one in Congress. There are some people who have advocated supporting this resistance movement, like in Michelle Bachmann's case, but nobody has advocated supporting resistance movements in general. This is not, yet this is so that's a big, tough leap, but I tried to make the case here, to you at least, that this is a case, and I think this is a case that some members of the Tea Party, especially Green Berets, might be willing to consider. People who were formerly served, the Green Berets was organized for this purpose. We organized the Green Berets for this purpose, and we created a crest for this purpose as an ideal that's lost. Your question is, how do we organize that? I would say the first step in the Baloch case is, here in Washington or in the United States, would be to explain that $6 billion or $7.5 billion in American aid is being used on F-16 jets and Cobra gunships to shoot our people who are fighting for the independence of their conquered country against an occupying power. Most people don't realize that most people have never heard of Balochistan, and most people don't realize that it's not a part of Pakistan. It's an ancient country, as Tariq was explaining, a beautiful traditional history. So a good way to affirm Balochistan's identity would be in a congressional fight over Pakistan aid, as Baloch identity being a part of that. I think what will open more doors for you, again in the Baloch case, would be what many Afghans have told to me. They have said, we can never have peace in Afghanistan as long as the Pakistanis are there. Many Afghans say that, and if we want to win peace and prosperity for Afghanistan, marrying our strategic goal to Pakistan becomes a false choice, because Pakistan will never be free. Now, there is a rising opposition to the war growing in Congress, and if this opposition can be channeled against Pakistani aid rather than Afghan funding, that would make more sense. What state are you from?
I'm originally from Sindh.
Sindh, but no, here in USA. I'm asking you as an American.
Virginia.
So who's your congressman?
Of course, Webb.
That's your senator.
Congressman is Moran.
Moran. Moran, I worked closely with. He confronted the administration on its deceptions on Bosnia. He can be thanked for that. He has spoken out on Sudan. He's actually he's not in the 23, but of the 10 Democrats closest to being in that 23, he's one of those 10. Make a friendship with him. Thank him on Bosnia and so forth. And every time, instead of when people like those three ladies in the Obama administration, Rice, Clinton, and Power, when they came up with those airstrikes and got them through, people should not complain, oh, why airstrikes there but not here? You know, that's to get help for any people fighting for their freedom is a big step for a congressman to take when he fights for anybody's freedom. And if we nourish that, you can do more with 10 thank yous than 10 you better do this. And so that should be nourished. It's a very fragile and not a common position, but Jim Moran is a fighter. He has accused State Department officials of lying about the genocide in Bosnia. Not many congressmen do that.
Thank you, Andrew.